Honey doesn't expire, like, ever. You could put some honey in a pot, close the lid, and put it in a dry, dark, cold environment, and come back like 3,000 years later, pop the lid open, and have a taste, and it would be fine. And we know this not just because we understand the chemistry or the science of honey, we know this because it happened. Archaeologists have found honey in an ancient Egyptian tomb that's over 3,000 years old, and when they opened the lid, the honey was perfectly fresh and preserved. It was not expired, there was no mold or anything growing on it. It was perfectly fresh. The oldest references to honey date back to cave paintings from over 7,500 years ago, where you can see people climbing up rope ladders to collect honey. Ancient people revered honey and treated it as sacred because of its sweet taste and golden appearance. And many civilizations, including the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Chinese, and ancient Georgians, used to eat honey for its nutritional and medicinal effects. Honey is made by several types of bees, but primarily the honeybee, obviously. And honeybees are social creatures. They live in groups, unlike solitary bees, which, yes, there are solitary bees that live alone their whole lives. Honeybees live in a society where there's three types of bees. There's drones, workers, and the queen. Workers and the queen are the female bees. The queen's job is to make more bees and also to inspect and make sure everything is working right. So for example, the queen will inspect and make sure that the hexagonal pattern in the honeycomb is just right. Otherwise, the bee who made that honeycomb will have to remake it. Worker bees are what it sounds like. They're the ones that do all the work. They collect the pollen, they make the honey, they take care of the new little baby bees. And the drones are all the male bees. So every single male bee is a drone. Male bees don't do anything in the hive, and their whole purpose in life is to mate with the queen and make more bees. And when they do mate with the queen, they actually die. They insert their endophallus into the queen, and once they're done doing their thing, they try and pull out, but their endophallus gets stuck in the queen, and when they fly away, their intestines get ripped out and they die. The same thing happens when honeybees try and sting you. When they sting you and they fly off, their stinger gets stuck in your skin and their intestines get ripped out when they fly away and they die. So for any male bees that don't end up mating with the queen, they only live about 8 weeks anyway, and by the time fall rolls around, if they're still alive, the female bees in the colony will actually kick the males out of the hive and say, go fend for yourself because you're not living here, because it just takes too much energy to keep them alive and they're not contributing to the hive at all, and so the female bees just kick them out. The worker bees basically do everything else in the hive, including making the honey. So what they do is they'll fly out and go to different flowers and drink the nectar from those flowers. Nectar is basically just sugar water that flowers produce. And while they're there, the bees are collecting the nectar, but they're also collecting pollen on a part of their leg called the pollen basket. Their intent is to take the nectar and the pollen back to their hive to make honey. An unintended but extremely important side effect of this process of bees going from one flower to the next to collect pollen and nectar is that they inadvertently pollinate over 80% of all flowering plants, including most fruit and vegetables and nuts and seeds and things like that. Next time you see a bee, maybe say thank you. And so on her way back to the hive, the bee will keep this nectar in something called the honey stomach, where some of her body enzymes start mixing with the nectar, starting the process of turning it into honey. Now, when she gets back to the colony, there's a process called trophallaxis, which is what grosses most people out about honey, but it's where the bees will regurgitate that nectar from their honey stomach into the mouth of another bee, who will then put that into her honey stomach and then regurgitate that out into another bee that'll put that into her honey stomach, and they'll do this a couple times before it ends up in the honeycomb. But in each of these transfers during the trophallaxis process, each bee is adding a bit of her own enzymes into that concoction that will eventually become honey. So during this process, the nectar will be converted into honey. The sugar in nectar is sucrose, the same thing that's in table sugar. It's basically just 50% glucose and 50% fructose, and it's a disaccharide. So it's the glucose bonded to the fructose to make a 2-sugar molecule, a disaccharide. And in that process, that disaccharide will be broken apart and turned into monosaccharides of glucose and fructose. Finally, they'll regurgitate this nectar honey concoction into a honeycomb, but it's not honey yet. It still has way too much water in it. So what bees will do is they will blow dry the honey to evaporate water. They'll turn around and they'll aggressively flap their wings at the honey, so they make heat and a wind current to evaporate the water away. And they do this until the honey gets to a very specific percentage of water, so around 17%, at which point it's done and they'll seal it with a coat of beeswax. So now that we know what honey is, before we can talk about why honey doesn't expire, we need to talk about why other foods do expire. And foods expire for many reasons, like heat and temperature, but mostly it's due to microbes like fungi or bacteria landing on the food, eating it, reproducing, eating more of it, reproducing more, producing waste, and just kind of ruining the food. So then why doesn't honey expire? Well, there's many reasons. One is it's a low water content. Bacteria need water to survive. They need water as the solvent for all the chemical reactions that occur in their body, just like we do for ours. So without sufficient water, bacteria can't survive. Honey is technically dry. It has very low water content. So if honey was left sitting out, it would start to absorb water from the atmosphere, increasing that percentage of water, allowing there to be enough water for bacteria to grow. It could potentially eventually expire because of that increasing water content. Another reason that honey resists bacteria is its high sugar content. Bacteria can't grow in high sugar or high salt environments for the same reason: osmosis. Bacterial cells have a very specific salt or sugar concentration, and if the environment that they're in has a much higher concentration, water will leave the bacteria osmotically. It'll diffuse through their cell membrane into their environment, basically drying and shriveling them up. And again, they need water to survive, and so if they're in an environment that causes them to lose water, they're not going to be able to survive. And honey's high sugar content does that. It creates an environment that's inhospitable to bacteria because it'll cause them to osmotically lose a ton of water. But this high sugar concentration, low water concentration can't be the whole story, as this study from 2010 showed, where researchers compared a 20% honey solution against various concentrations of sugar water to see how the antimicrobial properties compared. And what they noticed is for their sugar water concentration to have the same antimicrobial properties as the 20% honey solution, they needed to use a 40% sugar solution, twice as much sugar, to get the same antimicrobial properties as honey. So clearly, there's something else in honey that's helping it fight against bacteria. So as I mentioned previously, when the nectar is sitting in the honey stomach of the bee is adding enzymes to that nectar to try and turn it into honey. One of those enzymes is called glucose oxidase. This amazing enzyme takes glucose molecules and turns them into gluconic acid into hydrogen peroxide. If you've ever scraped your knee or got a cut, you know the antibacterial power of hydrogen peroxide. What hydrogen peroxide does is it creates hydroxyl free radicals. Free radicals are just molecules that have an unpaired electron, and so they're really looking for electrons. They're going to take electrons from anything. And so what they do is they'll take electrons from bacterial cells, causing the bacteria to die. That's how hydrogen peroxide works when you put it on your cut. That's exactly how hydrogen peroxide works in honey. So the presence of hydrogen peroxide in honey is adding to its antimicrobial properties. So glucose oxidase, like I mentioned, also makes gluconic acid. This gluconic acid is what makes honey slightly acidic. It gives honey a pH of 3 to 4.5, and since most bacteria are neutrophiles, which means they can only survive in pH ranges of 5 to 8, most bacteria just cannot survive in the acidic environment of honey. Now there are some bacteria like Helicobacter pylori, which is the cause of stomach ulcers, that can survive in extremely acidic environments, but most bacteria cannot. And finally, recently discovered, there is a peptide called defensin-1 that bees intentionally produce. This is an antimicrobial peptide that bees intentionally produce to put into their honey. So it's like a just in case. Like, we have all this stuff going on for us to make our honey safe from bacteria, but just in case, let's add a little bit of antimicrobial defensin-1 in there, just to be sure. So now you know why honey is naturally antimicrobial. It's got that low water content, it's got that high sugar content, the hydrogen peroxide, the acidic environment, and also the defensin-1 peptide that bees add. In fact, that same study from 2010 that I referenced, what they did is they also added chemicals to neutralize the pH, to get rid of the hydrogen peroxide, and to get rid of the defensin-1 in the honey. And what they noticed is once they did that, the honey solution had the same antimicrobial properties as any sugar solution. So a 20% honey solution had the same antimicrobial properties as a 20% sugar solution. So they proved that there's definitely more going on than just the high sugar, low water concentration, and it's all those other things that I mentioned. And finally, what do bees even make honey for? Like, don't they eat the nectar? Isn't that their food? Well, honeybees make honey as a food storage. For times like the winter, when there are no flowers, they still need to eat. And so they make honey as a food storage. They kind of tuck it away, just like we do with canned foods, for later use. Speaking of winter, I think this is so cool. In the winter, most insects go dormant and kind of just don't do anything and kind of like turn their bodies off and wait out the winter. Not honeybees. Honeybees will survive the winter by staying awake, and they group up in their hive and they shake their little bodies to create heat. And they warm up their hive. They warm each other up with body heat. But that takes a lot of energy, and so that's what the honey is for. They eat the honey to give themselves the energy to shake their little bodies, to create the heat, to survive through the winter. I think that's so cool. Alright, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, please hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the share button, hit the bell, hit all the buttons you can hit. It really helps me out a lot. So thanks again. I'll see you in the next one, and stay curious, everybody.